And you're welcome to the RTÉ Rugby Podcast. After Leinster exit the Heineken Cup at the semi-final stage, delighted to say Donald Lenihan, Bernard Jackman and Wes Liddy are with us as always to dissect the weekend's games. So it'll be La Rochelle, Donald Lagar's La Rochelle against Toulouse in the final, an all-French affair. Donald, I guess, look, very disappointing if you're a Leinster rugby fan, but I don't think there can be too many arguments that the better team on the day won out.
No question about that. Look, I think going into the semi-finals and having seen Toulouse against Munster in the game in Thomond Park, I felt they were La Rochelle and Leinster were the two best teams left in the tournament. And there was always a concern, given the sheer size of that La Rochelle pack and the quality that they had, that they would look to emulate that Saracens template of 2019 and 2020. And that's exactly what they did. You have to say, given the circumstances, after 10 minutes, I thought Leinster were going to pummel them and pull away from them. La Rochelle gave away so many penalties, conceded that early try. But to be fair to them, for a side who haven't been in that position of knockout rugby that often, they held their composure. And really, the manner in which they pulled away and bossed the second half sort of, I think, was a harsh lesson for Leinster. I think it highlights issues beyond Leinster's control that we've spoke about on this programme numerous times in terms of the competitiveness of the Pro 14. But look, I think it's going to be a very good final. I fancy La Rochelle, I must say. But having said that, Toulouse have an advantage over our sides in that they play against them 2 or 3 times. I think they've beaten them 5 out of the last 6 outings. But I think that's going to make it a riveting final, even though it's disappointing there's no Irish team there.
If you take that 10 minutes out, Bert, and as the game went on, as Donald said, I mean, there really was only one team playing rugby, and that was La Rochelle. And they played some brilliant rugby at times, albeit they did make some mistakes. And I guess if you want to be ultra critical, they weren't as clinical perhaps as Ronan O'Gara might have liked at certain stages inside the Leinster 22. But they played some brilliant rugby, and they played all the rugby.
Yeah, they did. I mean, when you think about the first 20 minutes, like to lose 3 kickoffs deep in your own 22 and the chaos that followed that for La Rochelle, it gave Leinster 3 brilliant opportunities to get field position. Their discipline at the breakdown for the first 20 minutes was really poor. So Leinster had, an awful lot of possession, and really to only score, 1 try with all that possession and that ill discipline from La Rochelle was a poor return. And once they sorted out, the right balance between being super aggressive at the breakdown and obviously being illegal, and Matt Cardy, in fairness, he stopped. He definitely got on the right side of him. Then there was only really 1 team in it, and it was I think O'Gara and John O'Gibbs actually weren't happy with their own attack, and yet, they won the game quite convincingly. Won by 9 points, but Ross Byrne's try at the end was a consolation score. So it just shows you how much possession they had and how dominant they were physically. That they beat Leinster by 9 points, going away really, and they're kind of not happy with how their attack performed.
So they feel they could have beaten them by a lot more. Is that basically?
Yeah, I think they didn't feel there was fluid as they would like to be. Now, in fairness, because they got so much joy out of going Route 1, and the impact that was having on Leinster, I can see why they continued to do that. But I certainly think that, given the amount of possession they had and good quality ball, they probably could have pulled the trigger a few more times, which is worrying for Leinster. I thought defensively Leinster were under serious pressure once La Rochelle got any bit of momentum and couldn't really regather and refine control, which I suppose is just the fact they're not used to it. It's just such a shock for them when they come up against the Saracens, a La Rochelle or a Racing, or Exeter aren't that power team that the other boys, that Saracens are, and La Rochelle, Toulouse, Racing are. They're different. They're more based around a lot of cohesion. They've got powerful players, but I think Exeter, it was a brilliant performance by Leinster, but I think Exeter are struggling to kick on from having won the double. They also have more players now playing international rugby, and they're just not at the level. They're not like Bristol are top of the Premiership, are very much vying with them for top rank there. I think Exeter maybe aren't as good as they were last year. And as I said, they're not as powerful a team as Leinster came up against the weekend, and yeah, they just weren't able to handle it, which was it's worrying for the Irish province's ability to go and win European titles again, and it's worrying from an Irish point of view as well, because let's be honest, we have struggled against teams like that, and I don't think the England game is enough of evidence to say that we found a way to do that. I think England obviously were just a little bit off this Six Nations.
It's fairly grim, isn't it, Wes, for a Leinster side containing what, I don't know, 13 or 14 internationals in the starting 15, that they can't problem solve against a side like La Rochelle, and equally that they seemed quite shell-shocked by the ability of the French side to play at the level that they were. I mean, I was just sat back in amazement, really, at their inability to fix problems on the pitch, and just seemed to completely overwhelmed by what the French side were putting up.
Yeah, you started to wonder a little bit, just, had maybe the lack of match time had a little bit of an impact, because the talk in the lead up to the game was that, if Leinster could maintain hold of possession and, build phases, that ultimately La Rochelle would tire in the second half. But as it transpired, if anything, it was the opposite that happened. But I suppose La Rochelle have bucked the trend a little bit in that, teams that have won this tournament, not that they've won it yet, but with the exception of Toulon, who probably put the best team we've ever seen on paper in the tournament out, all the other teams that have won it, that have built history in it, have kind of paid their dues, so to speak, have been knocking at the door for a number of years. And it was probably that sense that La Rochelle hadn't garnered that level of experience in Europe against the likes of Leinster that was certainly holding me back from thinking they were going to upset them. But I mean, it probably points to the fact that we all are a little guilty of, in an international context, of overrating a lot of the players playing at the highest level in this country. And that's not to say they're bad players or anything like that, but maybe we, I think with one or two exceptions, the rugby press in this country is fairly easy going on the national team and on the players associated. And I think maybe we don't recognize the value in other players from other countries by comparison at times. I mean, I was looking at the two packs on Friday or Saturday, and I was saying to myself, geez, I think there's only a couple of La Rochelle lads get in that Leinster pack. But in hindsight, it's probably the opposite argument you'd have made. So, it's just look, they lost a semi-final away from home in a season where they won a domestic league. So, in one sense, there's no need for an overreaction, but it was the kind of defeat, I think, that pointed to a couple of wider issues, both for Leinster and for Irish rugby, or certainly Irish provincial rugby more generally, I think.
What do you think about that, Donald? Are we guilty of overhyping the players in this country based on what we know is an awful domestic league in the Pro 14? The standard rugby is just way below in a lot of teams where it should be versus the very highest level. Are we guilty of over-egging rugby players in this country?
I think it's probably an extreme one way or the other. I mean, 2018 when Ireland, when they won a Grand Slam, they beat New Zealand. We all certainly saw them being contenders for the World Cup and getting to a semi-final of the World Cup, even though they were going to have to meet New Zealand or South Africa, we thought, or as it transpired, New Zealand on the way. I think, to be fair, the quality of the Pro 14 has dipped massively in the last 2 years, and therefore, as a result of that, our top players aren't tested often enough. I mean, you spoke about Leinster players there in terms of the quality going into the match. 13 of their starting team featured in the Six Nations Championship. So even though they hadn't been, you could say they weren't as cohesive as they normally would be, but they did have, they blew Munster away in a Pro 14 final, and they did beat Exeter away from home, having conceded 14 points in the opening 7 or 8 minutes. I think the problem is, and we've seen this with so many Irish teams over the past number of years, when an opposition gets a gets a grip on them in terms of controlling possession and controlling territory, not allowing both Leinster and Ireland, their game is predicated on dominating the gain line. Once they don't get that, they struggle massively. And you go back to Saturday's game, La Rochelle scrum, they only had 2 scrums in the first half, so they didn't get the chance to really impose that massive power. They got a penalty off the first scrum in the second half. They obviously said at half time, and you'd have to say at half time, Leinster, they were a point ahead, and you'd be reasonably happy with the way the game had gone. But they got a penalty off the scrum, kicked to the 22. They got another penalty off the line-out maul. They scored off that, and all of a sudden then you saw the template was in place. The other area where Leinster and Ireland suffer massively is when they don't control the breakdown. You could say that for all teams, but I thought the number of times, and Birch was kind of maybe hinting at some degree of illegality, but I always believe you have to adapt to what's happening on the on the hoof, on the pitch. You've got to interpret what the referee is doing. I mean, James Ryan twice, and I don't know, was there a kind of something at the back of his head where he was saying, look, I got to show form with a Lions selection coming up tomorrow and all this type of thing. But he took ball on off the base of a ruck when all the other forwards were on the deck. He got isolated in the tackle. There was a penalty given straight away, and that happened numerous times. So to be fair to La Rochelle, while they have that massive bulk in the front 5, fellas like Aldred and Victor Vito aren't bigger than our fellas, but they're very athletic. But the platform that's laid for them up front enables them to do the things that they do best. And Leinster, once they're on the back foot, and it's the same with Ireland, they just find it very hard to claw their way back into games.
So where do you start pointing the finger of blame then, Birch? I mean, is it individual performances within the team? I know James Ryan didn't have a particularly good game. I know certainly Ross Byrne had another very average game for me. James Lowe, Cian Healy, there's quite a few. Is it individual performances? Do you point the finger at the collective team performance? Do you look at the coaching system? Where do you kind of scratch it? And again, we know we're saying Heineken Cup semi-final isn't a bad season, but it is a bad season if you want to gauge where Leinster's objectives are, where they want to win this tournament.
Yeah, look, I think there's no doubt that Leinster players didn't play well. They didn't play well individually or collectively, but I would also say they weren't allowed to play well. I mean, James Lowe's errors came from, I suppose, good kicks in behind him and good kick chase and pressure. And, the one that he put up in the air at his own 22, he either ran that back or he kicked it back long, but he seemed to be completely frazzled. And that's what really good teams do to you. They put you in places you're not used to. They make it uncomfortable for you, and they expose any mental frailties or inexperience, probably not experience for Leinster, but just inability to deal with that physical onslaught, which in fairness was what La Rochelle brought. Other teams bring tactical smarts or technical detail. La Rochelle's 80% of it was about power. And I think that if you look at Leinster, and I think the game showed, like, people get carried away with this whole thing about, having a great culture is enough. And, the All Blacks sweeping the sheds, everyone should sweep the sheds, or culture. Culture is the reason the All Blacks are top. The All Blacks have an unbelievable amount of talent as well. They have a lot of depth in their talent pool. They lose players to Europe and Japan, but they have good players coming through all the time, pushing up. And Leinster have a phenomenal culture, and they have a good plan. Now, you could argue that they need to have a plan B to be able to play away from the contact zone, but they definitely have a good tactical plan week in, week out. But unfortunately, I think they're lacking talent in terms of depth to go and win Europe again, because they won in 2018, but we hadn't won it for a few years before that. We haven't won it since. And I think Leinster, given their budget, given their amount of internationals they have, they need to judge themselves on winning European Cups. That's achieving their potential at the moment. But when you look at the benches, and I look back at the Saracens' defeat in 2019 in Newcastle, and just look at our forwards alone. Saracens on the bench had Barrington. Okay, he's not top class, but he's a very good operator. They had Vincent Koch on the bench to come on. They Izwiki, who's a very good player, is going to play for England. They had Schaltberger to come on to replace Vunipola. They had Wigglesworth, Strettle, and Nick Tompkins. Nick Tompkins plays for Wales. Strettle has numerous English caps, very experienced. Richard Wigglesworth, a top quality tactical 9 to come on. At the weekend, La Rochelle, who, they had an Argentinian hooker, Bosch, to come on. Danny Priso, Arto Juli, Gordon, Retier, Polisson, Agrelon. I mean, Leinster's bench, when you look at Leinster's bench, I'm frustrated myself because I didn't take it into account pre-game, but there was no comparison between Leinster's bench. So you have and there was no comparison between the Saracens bench that Leinster had when they lost to them in Newcastle. So I think what Leinster have is an unbelievable amount of depth in terms of players who are good enough at Pro 14 level, okay, and are dominant at Pro 14 level. But to win Europe again, you need more talent. And I'll go back to 2009. When Paul McNaughton was involved, and they said, "Look, we got to push the boat out here. We got to go and win Europe." And obviously, we had Brian Driscoll, Shane Horgan, Malcolm O'Kelly. We had loads of good Irish players, but they went out and signed Rocky Elsom, CJ van der Linde, and Easton Asiwa to add to Felipe Contaponi and Chris Whitaker. And during the season, we brought in Stan Wright. So we had 6 very good foreigners. Stan Wright was the only kind of punt. The rest were all recognized as being top class. And then after that, obviously, they reduced the number of foreign players, but they had Brad Thorne for a season when they won the European Cup. Issa was there all the time. They had Nathan Hines, who was always good enough to start. And when you look at the Leinster squad at the weekend, I mean, Scott Fardy is your only non-Irish player that they have in their squad. And he was only selected on the bench. And I think that's where we're lacking. So I don't know what the reason is, whether Leinster, because of budget reasons, don't feel they can go out and spend the $500,000 or the 600,000 that you need to spend to get a top end player now. And maybe their budget is because they have to contract whatever, they use 58 players. They have to contract a lot of players between number 20 and 40 in your depth chart, and they're expensive because some of them are capped, etc. But I think at the moment, I think they're lacking that external X factor that's a different profile to what we have, that all the teams who are competitive in Europe have. So for example, Exeter are competitive in Europe. They've Stuart Hogg, Johnny Gray, for example. They'll go out and bet the top end players that they can't bring through their own pathway. And for some reason, Leinster, and again, I don't know the reason why, but if you look at the quality of foreign player signing, even compared to Marcel Coetzee, obviously compared to Damien Delande, RG Snyman, I think they're going to have to readdress it. And even with all the internationals they have, to win Europe, I think you need a little bit more. And I don't think, my point was that there's a talent deficit there against the top teams in Europe that doesn't get exposed. And so I wouldn't be blaming coaches. I'd be looking at actually the whole squad and what they need to add to it to get over the line again, because I think I don't see them being able to bridge that gap without stepping in and going heavy in the recruitment market.
Does that go back to what you were saying originally, Wes, though, that maybe Leinster have an overinflated sense of their own self-worth in terms of the players coming through, and that they've made a decision, maybe they have made a decision, or maybe it's constraints financially, that they're going to back their academy system and players coming through, and that's the way they're going to operate. Maybe it's Leinster who need to readjust their own expectations of the caliber of players that are coming through their youth system, which we're constantly told, by the way, is top class feeder system from the school system through to the academy, through to Leinster is one of the models to be held up as one of the bright shining lights of European rugby. But maybe that's not enough to go and win this competition.
Yeah, I agree with Birch, and look, I'm a bit biased probably on this kind of idea of these outlier players. I've been banging that drum for a long time, but I mean, the biggest example of that on the field at the weekend of someone who brings an abnormal physical skill set to things was Will Skelton. Now, bizarrely, Will Skelton has been viewed as an oddity throughout his career rather than recognised for what he is, which at this point is probably one of the most impactful forwards in the world.
Yeah.
But I'm only being slightly facetious here, and being honest about it, I know it from first-hand experience having these conversations. If Will Skelton was in the academy in Leinster or arguably any other province, they would be saying he needs to lose 20 kilos and he can't play till he's Broncos under 5 minutes. They would be not picking him for what he can't do, rather than picking him for what he does bring to the team. And that is a product, possibly, of maybe too surefire a belief in your system, and maybe a kind of a cookie cutter approach to player development that is permeated across all the provinces because it's a central system and they subscribe to one model. As far as Birch's point about contracting players from 35 to 50, it's bang on. I mean, if that's 15 players at 100 grand, that's 1.5 million. Like, La Rochelle's budget's been quoted a few places in the last few days, and it's, you know, they're quoting an operating cost as a playing wage.
Those figures are incorrect. They're incorrect.
Completely wrong.
Yeah. So I can just come in and clarify that. Yeah. I just want to clarify the budgeting because, just the budget, and then I'll go back to you. It's used as an excuse when we don't achieve what we should achieve. So the salary cap in France is 11.5 million. Okay. I doubt La Rochelle are at the salary cap. Okay. I doubt it. I'd say they're spending maybe 10.5 million or whatever, which would compare favorably or equally with what Leinster's total spend would be. The stuff you get thrown out about operating budget, that includes the buses for the under 16s, that includes the stewards. It's everything that goes out from a club during the year. But that's irrelevant. I mean, that's irrelevant to comparing player squads, you know. And also, let's be honest, there's a tax break here. So in theory, you know, Irish players will stay for a little bit less here. So it's not a level playing field. The French
and also the union are paying the salary of your most valuable players anyway. If you're an Irish province, i.e., you're centrally contracted guys. So it's a ridiculous line to be putting out there as an excuse. But like, it's not so pronounced with Leinster because, as Birch said and Donald said, their players 30 to 50 have the ability to dominate in the Pro 14. But there is a danger that you can stockpile mediocrity. And people talk about international setting the standard for a squad, but they don't, because they're away half the season. The standard culturally is set by the guys behind. And if you have 20 average players in your squad, that starts to become the pervading culture within the squad, you could argue. And I would argue some of the Irish teams, it's more applicable to some of the others, but they should nearly tackle their lack of depth by cutting squads further and making it more competitive to get in there. As in, if you were outside number 30 in the squad, or what's going to be used regularly, and you're 25 years of age, in other words, you're a developed player rather than an emerging player. Like, if you're not good enough to play in a Heineken Cup winning team for Ulster, Munster, Leinster, there's an argument that they should be gone and the next guy from the academy brought up. And that makes it much more competitive at academy level, and it makes it much more competitive at that bottom rung of your squad. So I think when you combine that with the kind of lack of outlier players, you start to get into a bit of trouble. Like when Leinster were at their best, when they won 3 European Cups in 4 years or whatever it was, like you looked at the big moments in the big games, whether it was Gordon Darcy turning over Fofana over the try line, whether it was Johnny Sexton inspiring that comeback. They had big players that produced against big opposition at big moments. Like, they had world-class players. Now they have a machine which is kind of 8 out of 10 all the time and is good enough most of the time. But when they've come up against these teams with these outlier players like Sarries, now like La Rochelle, they haven't been able to produce those moments. So I think that is an issue.
And if you look at that Leinster team, Donald, and you say, right, how many world-class players do they have? You could say Tadhg Furlong, and is that about it?
Yeah, well, look, just park that for a second. I want to pick up on some of the points that Birch and Wes have made there. There's times when you can actually become a product of your own success. And, you know, when everybody's coming from all over Europe and they're coming into Dublin, they want to see how you're producing all these players, then maybe you do get a little bit comfortable within your own setup. There is probably a position as well whereby you become a product of your own success in that if you've 20 fellas constantly away and you're conscious of the fact that you could have 20 fellas away with Ireland at a World Cup or in a Six Nations camp or the Autumn Series, then it becomes about bringing volume into your group, which kind of hits into where Wes was coming from. I mean, was it the game against Munster recently where Leinster brought on the 57th and 58th player who played for them in the Pro 14 this season alone? So like, that's fantastic to have that depth. But I think we're recognizing now that a lot of them are all maybe at that same level, Pro 14 level, which when you get to the last four in Europe, and let's face it, Leinster have been, except Saracens beat them in the quarterfinal last season or last September, but you know, they are a top four side. But there is no doubt that they are lacking that extra bit of quality, the type of that overseas added value that you can't intrinsically get in the makeup of the beast we have here in Ireland. So there's no doubt, I think that Leinster maybe have taken their eye off the ball from that, excuse me, from that point of view, because power has been the thing that has prevented them from advancing either to semi-finals or finals now in the last 2 or 3 years. So you go back to the Skelton thing. I mean, Skelton, I remember when Raj bought him, he was really excited about him. I mean, he was out there with Saracens. There was talk about him going back to Australia. Like, Skelton is a freak. And when you look, let's say Fardy and Devon Toner, one is 35, I think, one is 34, coming to the end of their careers. Leinster and Ireland, you'd be happy. Look, there's a potential second row in the making for Leinster and Ireland with Ryan Baird and James Ryan for the next number of years. But at the cutting end of Europe, as a combination, are they the right two together to be able to win a Heineken Cup? You know, from what we've seen with Saracens and with La Rochelle, and indeed, you know, with the likes of Toulouse, then maybe they're not. So, I mean, Skelton, I remember the first time I saw Skelton, he was playing for the Waratahs against the Lions in 2013. He was 20 years of age. He was playing because the other second rows were in the Wallaby squad. Johnny Sexton was the week before the first test, and Johnny Sexton took a ball up. And the next thing, he disappeared. He got enveloped by this man mountain. He was stretchered on the ground. I thought he'd never get up again. Yeah. To be fair to Johnny, he did get up, and he was, but it was like a fly hitting the windscreen when you're driving to Dublin, and it was gone. But I remember standing outside waiting for a taxi to go back to the hotel, and Skelton, he was only 20 years of age. He came out, he still had his shorts on, his plain shorts. He had a kind of a tracksuit with a gear bag over him and a pair of leather shoes, and he was waiting for a lift to go home. And he was enormous. Now, they had a problem in getting him aerobically fit, and he's never really fitted into the Australian way. But he is certainly, to be fair to Raj and John O'Gibbs, they saw something that he could add to their group. And there's no question that he has done that. We are probably lacking that type of player. Leinster had it when they had Brad Thorne, when they had Nathan Hines, Rocky Elsom in a different shape. So, and Munster had it when you brought Jim Williams in that time. But I agree 100% with Birch on this. You've got to get the mix right, and that little bit of X factor from outside if you need it to close the gap with the others. But maybe when everybody's telling you you're doing a brilliant job producing all these players, you just take your eye off the ball a bit. But there's no question in my mind that Leinster will sit down after this. They will reassess where they are. And I mean, the model is there. I mean, Munster and Ulster have been able to bring in high-profile overseas players, the Sneymans, the Kutsias, the Dealandes. So why not Leinster? They shouldn't be penalised because their production line is good. But I think what we're seeing now, it's not broad enough to generate the key type of players that are the missing ingredient in getting over the last hurdle. And I also think the tide is rising. We're seeing a number of French clubs playing real good quality rugby at the moment. So therefore, as I say, you've always in Europe, you've had one or two outlier clubs. It was Toulon who won 3 in a row. Then it became Saracens. Exeter were on a mission, but they looked absolutely knackered because of what happened with COVID. Their season was extended. They've looked knackered all year. But Toulouse, La Rochelle, really, and they've had a bit of luck, let's be honest about it. Like, they played Edinburgh in the opening game. The game against Bath was cancelled, so they won. They got their 28 points out of that. They got Gloucester in a quarter-final Sale. But this was the real test on Saturday. And by God, did they show that they're capable of playing at that level. And you just have to take the opportunities. Maybe it's written in the stars that this is going to be their year.
Maybe it is. And just, the power obviously is one huge aspect of the game, and the likes of Skelton and what they can bring. And you mentioned the type 5 Bert as well for La Rochelle. But I was also struck by the brilliant rugby that they played. When they did use the power to win possession and the set piece, whatever, they were able to throw the ball around so comfortably between backs and forwards, offloading the ball, overlapping, supporting each other as well, where Leinster just weren't able to do that on the day. And again, it's a theme with Toulouse. You can see it as well. The way they play rugby when they beat Munster was the same thing. They set the foundation, and then when they had the foundation, they were able to execute it brilliantly and in a way that actually was really entertaining to watch.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Look, they're a good side. The only issue they have with Toulouse is that mental block. But you could see them. They weren't daunted in any way by playing Leinster, who have a huge amount of experience. It's an all-French final. They know them well. They've obviously lost a few games against them, but I think they'll be set up. I mean, they're well coached, as you said. And, even Toulouse, and I want to get back to this, even Toulouse, who have the best academy in French rugby, and spend a huge amount of money working with their local clubs, has always been an area where good young French players migrate towards. I mean, they have gone out and signed Richie Arnold, Rory Arnold, Charlie Faumina, Jerome Kino on the bench, and Colby. Like, that's the reality. That's what we're up against. So it's not a knock on Leinster's academy, or it's great to have so many good young Irish players, but there's not a sport in the world that don't go and find talent, don't find match winners, and recruit them to help the overall team. And I don't think it takes from the international team for Ireland. I think at the moment we're at a stage where the international team are treading water at third in the Six Nations. We're not able to get the deal done at European level. I think that psychologically can deflate our internationals as well. If you're James Ryan, right, and you played against La Rochelle at the weekend, I know he's only come back from injury, but there's no doubt in the dressing room or the weeks after you feel that lack of power. Whereas if you play alongside a Will Skelton or a George Cruz or Mario Itoje, and you beat teams like that, it improves your self-belief, your confidence, etc. So it's 100%, and we probably need to be a little bit more ruthless in terms of and whatever I know there's constraints with this player pathway and Team Ireland, but the reality is, if our provinces can't bring success, like, our provinces do are self-funded to some extent. It's not a complete subsidy system. So, like, I just think if we have provinces who are at the real business end of Europe, are capable of winning it, they'll generate their own funding from within, as well, to a certain extent, or maybe go down the third party route. Are Leinster allowed to go out and get third party backing if it's a budget constraint to sign?
Is it a budget constraint, do you think? Is it a budget constraint?
Look, I'm sure Leinster have to spend a lot of money to keep what they have, and part of that.
It can't be a budget constraint when Munster were going to sign Peter Steph Dutoit, and they had a backer to come in and support that, but the RFU pulled the plug on that. So therefore, it's not just down to budget alone. Sorry, Bert, for cutting across you there.
No, absolutely. No, it's not clear. That's the thing. Look, exactly. I agree with you, Donald. That one's not budget constraints. Is there pressure on Leinster if they sign someone from outside to move somebody? There's lots of rumours of that it's kind of it's a bargaining position. Yeah, if you go and get a 6, you've got to move a Max Deegan or whatever, and maybe then they decide not to do that. We don't know. It's not clear. It's not transparent, and maybe it doesn't need to be. But certainly, as Irish rugby supporters, I think it needs to be looked at. I think it's a travesty that we can't win Europe again. And like, look, I go back to Munster 2006, 2008, Leinster 2009. You know, in a decade where we were still finding our feet in terms of professionalism and Europe, we were able to win. And for all the talk about how brilliant our system is, we're not really winning what we aspire to win, or looking like we're guaranteed. Like, if Leinster go into Europe next year, okay, they'll have, you know, Johnny Sexton might be back, Kellen Doris might be back, but realistically, like, can we say that squad, you know, will be able to go and beat the best in Europe? I think I can't say confidently.
Yeah, and even just to take up on the point there in terms of there's no doubt in my mind that when the provinces are doing well and they are winning in Europe, the feel-good factor when you go into that international camp, there's no question that aids the international team. It also puts up the ante for the other provinces because, you know, when it was Munster who were dominant, the Leinster fellas were a national squad kind of jealous of these fellas. Likewise, when Leinster had been dominated throughout the last decade, Munster and Ulster were there. They were doing everything they could to try and catch up with them. So success breeds success. You mentioned James Ryan, Birch. Do you remember when he came into the national, or to his first year in professional rugby? Everybody was waxing lyrical about the fact he went something like 21 games without being defeated, be it with Leinster and Ireland. So there's a feel-good factor definitely parallel with that. But I want to go back to you and just take you up on the point. La Rochelle, yes, they played very good rugby, but I wouldn't say it was all court attacking wide rugby. I think Raj is pulling the wool over a lot of fellas' eyes with, you know, this keep ball alive stuff. If you analyse why did they beat Leinster, the quality of their scrum, which gave them the platform, they got a couple of penalties out of it. The quality of their line-out maul, which pummeled Leinster into giving away penalties. Their work at the breakdown, where they generated about 4 turnover penalties. The quality of the kicking from the halfbacks, and Carbarlow in particular. And West, he was a running, passing fly half. And, you know, to be fair to Raj, I think he's developed him in terms of his tactical awareness and his kicking. And the last bit of the element, which was probably the most important, was their defensive structure and organisation. They had that banana defence. They were pressurising Leinster from the outside in. They were imposing shooters as well. So Leinster were panicked into cutting back into the big forwards. So, you know, I think it kind of suits the narrative to say they got the ball wide and they're a lovely squad. But if you look at all the basics of the game, without the ball, they suffocated Leinster.
No, you're wrong. It's all about the offloading. It's all about the offloading.
Oh,
you're wrong. You're wrong. Yeah. I just pick something you said earlier, right? If it's not a budgetary issue in terms of being able to sign these impact players, foreign players that could come in, the likes of the Rocky Elsmans, Nathan Hines, etc. over the years, if it's not a budgetary constraint, are those kind of signings being vetoed then by David Nucifora? Are the Leinster and Munster being told you can't sign those players because they're being told to develop from within? And is it an instruction coming from on high that prevents them from signing the likes of Steph Dutoy?
Yes. The simple answer is yes. But you go back, to be fair, there is logic. Everything in Ireland, like the national team is at the top of the pyramid. So everything is geared towards trying to generate success through the provinces to the benefit of the national team. Where the control from the RFU came in initially was in the key elements, in the key positions on the pitch. In other words, you know, you can only have 1 foreign 10 or 1 foreign 9. And there is logic to that, in my view, when you only have, say, 4 provinces. If you had 2 out halves from overseas, Dan Carter and Will Genia playing for Munster and Leinster, what does that do for the national team in terms of bringing on their number 10? I actually see logic in that. I don't have a difficulty. If you remember, Sean Moore, the Australian captain, the hooker, was stopped from joining Munster because it was seen as he'd be blocking a place for the young hookers who were coming through. And in those specialist positions, I do actually see logic. But I think we've got to look at the broader picture now and try and balance that logic on one side with the benefits that are derived by bringing in a Peter Steph Dutoy or a Dan Carter or a Dougie Howlett, Ison Asewe. What do they add to the overall picture? How does that make those individual provinces better? And so therefore, that is serving the national cause, albeit in a different way. I think we've just got too blinkered, where our first reaction is to close off those overseas signings. It's a bit like, you know, the blanket ban on any player who goes abroad can't play for the international team. And we've discussed that as well. There are merits to that in certain situations, but in other situations, if you've no full back left and Simon Zebo is the only man left standing, does it make sense not to pick him? So I think we've got carried away, and it's probably David Nucifora he has this all-encompassing power, and maybe it's time to question that, and maybe it's time to review what worked for us 5 years ago may not work for us now. All successful organizations, the time to review and adjust is when you're on top. Now, we were on top in 18. Leinster won the Heineken Cup. They won the double. Ireland won that Grand Slam. But we've been slipping down since. The World Cup was a disaster for us, and we haven't really recovered from it. And both provincially and nationally, we've been sliding since the World Cup. So therefore, what we're doing isn't working. And if you don't change things, then everything stays the same, and that's what's happening at the moment.
Yeah, and the World Cup was a disaster, Birch, and nothing seems to have changed. Really. There hasn't been any, certainly to my eye, or that I can make out, it hasn't been any kind of material difference in our approach to the game overall, the strategy here. So, I mean, what happens next?
Look, I don't think there's any harm in having a review of. I know we're not great on reviews, and the World Cup review has stayed a secret. No one knows what was in it. Only what we were kind of told, and even some of those things weren't acted upon. So, for example, one of the big things we weren't apparently skillful enough as an international side, but yet where has been the action to address that? Like Munster don't have a full-time. Munster are one of the few professional teams who don't have a full-time skills coach. You know, so if skills is a deficit, and we have a huge amount of money being invested in the pro game, why haven't we addressed that in terms of some kind of a skills program, etc.? It's just it's just very, very strange. And I'm looking back at that 2018 team that won. I mean, you had Scott Fardy, who started number 6. He was, 3 years younger, and you had Easton Asiwa in there, who we know was a phenomenal player. So even then, they had, two top-end internationals, and obviously, Sean Cronin and Keane Healy, Devin Toner were all a little bit younger. Dan Levy was fit, and their bench was a hell of a lot stronger. Their bench at the time was Joey Carberry, Gibson Park, Jack Conan, Reece Ruddock, Andrew Porter, Jack McGrath are guys on it. So, like, we've lost. I know we've injuries, but we have lost our way a little bit. And as Donald said, it's not working. What are we going to do? Just double down and do the same thing again? Or are we actually going to look at what led to 2018? What was happening in 2015, 16, 17, and what was the age profile of the team like? And what was the why were we able to do that then at international level and at provincial level? But I just don't see us getting out of this hole, to be honest, unless we drastically change. In fairness, I admire Munster. They've addressed that they're not as competitive as they need to be. They want to get past semi-finals. They want to win trophies, and they've gone out and signed, Simon Zebo, co-funded, Damien Delande, RG Snyman, and obviously Jenkins coming in. Fair play to them. That's what we want. We want our provinces to be pissed off, not achieving what they feel is their right to achieve, and making decisions and acting to change that. And that's probably going to have to happen in Leinster now. And it sounds terrible because obviously they're a successful team in terms of win ratios. But I genuinely believe that Leinster, Munster should be able to be winning European Cups again, and Ulster obviously a little bit behind in terms of budget, etc. But Leinster, Munster should be at the top table, and at the moment we're a little bit off it. So you'd have to expect, that's what high performance is. It's identifying weaknesses and changing it. And Wayne Smith has a great synopsis of performance. The former All Black coach. He says performance is your capabilities multiplied by your behaviours, right? There's absolutely no doubt that the Irish team's behaviours are very strong. They all have an unbelievable work ethic. They all have a real purpose in terms of trying to win things for provinces. But if your capabilities are less than your opponents, you can't win. I mean, look at the 4x100 meter in the Olympics. Obviously, the odd time there's an outlier, but most of the time it's the Americans and the Jamaicans, because they have the 4 fastest guys in their team. Like that's the reality. And at the moment in rugby, despite all the tackle technique, despite all the defensive systems, power and size is still massive, and particularly in the Pro 14 where there's a deficit of it. So someone like Papali'i for Connacht can come on for 20 minutes against Ulster and actually turn the game. Papali'i his rugby pedigree in terms of being a world-class player is miles away. He's a rugby league convert, but he has power and size, and because we lack that, that can influence a game, and that's the problem for us when we go to play the top teams in Europe. They have 5 or 6 guys like Papali'i, and we struggle.
Yeah, culture is great,
yeah,
I guess.
And without that power, then it goes back. Sorry, I have this little slip of paper here. I have it in my notebook all the time. I keep transferring it. They were actually what we learned from the review. The only thing that came out sort of publicly in the review of the World Cup in 19 was a failure to develop their style of play. In other words, if you remember, Ireland had got to a certain point in 18. They kept trying to do what worked for them then, but by the end of 19, the opposition had cottoned onto it. Psychological shortcomings, a need to continue developing Irish players' skill sets. So those 3 things, I think we still haven't resolved. Psychological shortcomings. Look at Ulster last weekend. They were well in control of that game against Leicester, semi-final of the Challenge Cup. Yeah. And they actually went into the dressing room believing they had the job done. Like, you didn't have to be a rocket scientist to come out and say, well, Leicester, they're going to throw the kitchen sink at you after the break. You've got to be ready for this. But Leicester exploded out of the blocks, and you have psychologically, Ulster collapsed. Talk about the other one, a failure to develop their style of play. We have known for a number of years here that we lack against sides who have that massive power. The South Africa's, France, England. But have we seen any signs of a development in our own style of play that enables us to get around that deficit, or to play, for example, the way Japan have developed their game? We haven't. And we're now nearly 2 years after the World Cup, and there has been no gains made on that front either. So I do think we have serious issues, both at provincial and international level, to address if we want to get back to where we were a couple of years ago.
Okay, lads, we're just out of time. Just before we leave, Donald, there are South African fans now tuning into the RTÉ Rugby podcast to hear your Lions weekly updates. Any news on whether it actually is going to go ahead or not? Have you heard anything at all? I know that the squad is going to be named tomorrow and a captain by Warren Gatland. Does that mean anything, or is it just a squad for the squad's sake at the moment?
Yeah, look, I think it has to go ahead at this stage. In fact, I was talking to 1 or 2 sponsors just by coincidence in the past week, and they're adamant that it will go ahead. But I do find it incredible that Warren is announcing the squad tomorrow live, and the British and Irish Lions website and all this, but we still don't know where 4 of the 8 matches are going to be played. I just find that incredible. So look, I'd be amazed if it doesn't go ahead at this stage. I was skeptical all along. I'm still skeptical, but I can see that we get to this point now where you're announcing 36 players tomorrow and a massive fanfare and all that goes with it. So look, it looks as if it is going ahead. The pub, well, sure, we don't have pubs anymore. I was going to say the pub fantasy Lion squads that normally go on. We've only been confined to reading them in the paper, but look, all will be revealed tomorrow.
Yeah, and you wouldn't be overly confident that Ireland will have too many players. You never know. You never know. But look, we'll wait and see. And it's something we'll talk about on the podcast next week. Fascinating stuff, gents. For anyone who's continuing to listen in and wondering where the hell Wes has gone, he had a bit of a technological issue, so unfortunately we lost him. But look, thanks to Bernard.
I think he had to go back to school, did he?
Yeah, the junior cert mocks are on in about half an hour, so you got to get in for that. Thanks to Donald and to Bernard. We're back on the podcast next week. Talk to you then.